So this was built for the cost of a year's rent. It's where we operate, although now we're dispersed. We have several offices, studios around the place, and we've always been a dispersed practice. So COVID has been no problem for us because we've always worked everywhere and nowhere. This is the bridge across the Wild Garlic into the studio. You can see scavenged windows on the south side, bringing that afternoon light in, and then winter, obviously, space below that we use for various workshops and things, but a language of construction that allowed everything to be built on top or outside of everything else. So, you know, there's a beam with a joist and everything sits outside and outside and outside and outside. No complex cutting, no complex measuring, no complex drawings. Super simple, adaptable, versatile kit of parts that came straight off the saw that could be built with anyone. You can see that wonky underside to the beam because, of course, that didn't need to be regular. Just needed that one good face on the top of it. Going inside, I like this idea that there was a zero waste. So we just made the scaffolding, and the scaffolding then became the floors and the furniture. We pieced together insulation from eBay, seconds, elf cuts, all that kind of stuff, scavenged windows from another project. And the language of the building, the setting out of all of those studs, that could only happen through people who had never built before working out how to do things. I couldn't draw this building because it would be much more boring. It would be regularized. And I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in the building taking on the language of the people that made it. This is the afternoon sun coming in, summer and winter, and this is it. And this is the space underneath it that we use for workshops. So this program, Studio in the Woods, has landed here occasionally, and we use that space underneath. We set up a temporary kitchen. My daughter runs the kitchen there, you know, and people come and eat and, again, share ideas and knowledge and so on. The little other sketch building, I call these sketches, they're like sketchbooks for real that we build around here. The second building, the third building, I suppose the house was the first, then the studio was the little bathroom that we built out of the little bits of material that were left over from various projects over the years. One Christmas, we thought we'd build a zero cost, zero waste building again. We built this little bathroom for the studio here. Again, hired a digger, again, just with people not really knowing they were doing architecture. Probably most people wouldn't consider this is architecture. You know, leftover tiling battens, leftover you know, pieces of translucent polycarbonate. And I sort of think this idea that you can find beauty in the most basic of materials is a very lovely one. You know, I don't believe in this idea that you have to spend a lot of money on materials to make something beautiful, although I will show you projects that have cost a lot more money. And so then, of course, doing the drawing after you've built it as a way of recording what you've done, and then finally making a model as a recording of that, you know, everything the wrong way around. And I kind of enjoy that. So the next and two little other sketches that we've done here, which are kind of interesting for me as somebody who now manages a woodland alongside our practice, is that we have a lot of timber that we take out as part of our management plan. We're taking out all the softwood, and we end up with stacks of timber we don't know what to do with. So sometimes we regularize them into 5 inch by 2 inch, so 125 by 50 mil, and you can kind of build anything out of that. And I like having a stack of timber, so when we need to build a building, we just build a building using what I call equivalent materials. And I call this building equivalent. It's an equivalent building. It just uses the same material everywhere for everything, 5 by 2 timber for everything. And of course, then the language of the pieces of structure and everything else take on the set, you know, laminating, because everything becomes laminated up because you need to thicken it where you need, you know, spans or strength or cords or whatever. And then again, we build it with a digger, same people, you know, I can't remember, one Easter, I think we built this building very simply, very cheaply. You can see the prefabricated elements in the workshop just up here on the left, and then, you know, finished there and clad and used again for kind of prototyping and so on. The next one we built was a little prototype house. Again, we had more of that 5 by 2 timber, and we needed some extra accommodation here for the courses and so on that we run. So we built this little building called trailer on a chassis that could be towed down long, thin. So in theory, we designed this to be transportable on a public highway, long, thin, but then kicking out in section, but also these 2 pods that kick out to give you a little bit more space for kitchen and bathroom. Same technique, made on the ground. First one becomes the template for the second one. That's the trailer we towed down with the materials that sat on it that then were put up by our neighbors. This guy with the hat is a trapeze artist and canvas maker, you know, and just brought in people that had a set of skills that happened to be in the right place at the right time to make this. None of them builders, none of them carpenters, you know, but a language of building that anyone can build, a language of making buildings in a rural context where you just need resourceful people and you don't need highly skilled contractors. And that's kind of what I'm interested in trying to harness. So this is the little trailer. Actually, this is it. In the inside, we bought an old hoarding that was around a project and turned it the other way around, and then used that, the good side, as all the sheathing material, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Made everything again, made the stair, you know, and all the internal fittings and the kind of ropes were left over from various projects for handrails and, you know, all that kind of stuff. This is the wild garlic that we have in May here, that we harvest and make wild garlic pesto that we keep for a year. This is my daughter, her partner John. They're off to Australia on Friday for 2 years. He's a doctor, and they've been living there for 3 years, in fact. This is as they live in it, and this is those bales left over from various other projects. And yeah, so you can see why this is the practice. This is what we mean by practice. And, you know, we are practicing making buildings, and, you know, and people come, people go. We have no fixed workforce here. You know, we're just a group of people that get together to make stuff. But importantly, rather than being self-indulgent, homemade just for us, what does it mean if we upscale that and take that onto a much bigger scale? So we do much bigger work for, you know, this is a government agency, the Forestry Commission, who, this is the best collection of timber possibly in the world. It's the Western Belt Arboretum, the National Arboretum. And they asked us to make 2 buildings for them, a shed and a place that they could get together to have their meals, and a mess room, they call it. And we won this on the strength that we could just build a steel shed and, you know, and a little whatever else. So we challenged that. So we said, well, we could build you a shed, but let's build a shed with your material. We thought we'd build what we call a Belfast truss, which is taking timber and cutting it into small sections and then nailing it together. Low skill, lots of redundancy in the fixing. But then we looked and we realized that they have the best timber in the world. And why wouldn't we take that timber and use it in whole pieces, because we didn't need to travel, didn't need to move anywhere. So we felled these trees and we used them in their 22-meter lengths. So we used them whole, as in complete lengths. They didn't have to travel, didn't have to move, and they're the biggest pieces of timber ever used, I think, certainly in UK construction. So we were asked to build this. This is what we were asked to do. And again, my point earlier, you never do what you're asked to do. This is what we're asked to do. But in fact, we looked and thought that that's kind of interesting language of building still, and the little every settlement in almost any rural place, and you'll recognize this in India, often has a smaller building where you keep warm and you gather socially and you're with family, and then other types of buildings where you make or work. And this is a kind of farmstead that could be anywhere in the world, a little building that's enclosed, that has an upright thing where people get together, keep warm, and then other bigger buildings that are generally simple frame structures where people work. We thought we'll just make that, you know, we'll make a little building that's upright and special, because we know when we see a special building that is special and something different happens, there's a different manner of gathering, and this is the local village. And we'll make a big span building out of, you know, framed materials. So we ran a hewing workshop to cut these by hand, these timbers, to hew them down to the section sizes that we need, still in their 22-meter long pieces. And then we took those pieces, and then we were given some money to run a program in heavy carpentry, post and beam, king post trusses. So we made king post trusses on the ground. You know, you can see the scale of that with somebody who's, I think, 6 foot, so, you know, nearly 2 meters standing in the middle of that. And then lifted them into place and made this building with a, you know, I think the door is 3 meters, but it's a person-sized door that then brings you into this big span structure that then uses all the waste material again on the outside of the building. So just to remind you, we're asked to build that, and of course, you know, we made that. and this and that. Again, we were asked to make, but we made this, and I think it's 7 meters to the underside of the door even there. It's a huge building. That's Barack Obama for scale. He didn't visit, I photoshopped him in, but it gives you an idea of scale there. So this is an ordinary building. It's an ordinary building, unlike the building at the AA. Because I think sometimes you can make ordinary buildings. And sometimes I believe what Clough Williams-Ellis said when he said, we need more ordinary buildings. We don't need more extraordinary buildings, And I like ordinary buildings. This is what I showed you first. The ordinary buildings that just sit calmly in a place and deal with weather and climate and the processes of stuff in a very inevitable way. So this is then looking at the other building beyond, which is the little mess room that we built. And it has one inflection, which is just drops down to bring the morning sun into the yard to thaw the frost when it comes in at this time of the year, midwinter here. It gets cold in the mornings. It's never so cold you can't do anything, but the frost on the ground, because we freeze thaw, we sit around 0, clearing that frost with the sun in the morning is important. So this is then the building that we made. We made it in a different manner. It's one space with some sort of services that sit around, servicing elements that sit around it. And again, made it with their own people, their own volunteer, the different language of construction, different language of material. We had oak to use, and oak was a very difficult material for unskilled people to work with. So we covered it up, and so every one of these has a backing cut on where we're dealing with a hyperbolic paraboloid roof. So we covered that up with a skin on the inside of plywood, and on the outside use oak to clad it because these small pieces could deal with that double curvature. So very simple, upright little building that somehow announces it's more special than the working place, because this is where people, as I said, keep warm. They come in out of the cold. They can have a shower. They can have lunch. They can do whatever they need to do before they go out in the weather again in the afternoons. So that's that skin of ply on the inside. And looking due south to get the sun in, keeping the special bits of money for when you have frame views out into woodland, and skinning it, bringing light in a very simple and cheap way, which is just with polycarbonate. So we made everything with them. We made the kitchen, of course, with just ordinary concrete, and you can see the kitchen there, just made with unskilled people who then took all of these skills back and made some of their own buildings and own houses. With the skills that they'd kind of garnered through the process of making, this building with us. I'm just going to touch on a few urban projects because I think that there's something, or an urban project. There's something very interesting about working in cities, and I've talked a lot about working in rural places, but the extraordinary thing that we have all lived through. You in particular in India is in our lifetime. So to give you a statistic, mentioned my grandparents, but when my grandparents were born, 2% of the world was urbanized. Now it's 50%. So in kind of 3 generations, we've gone to 50% urbanized. It's a flocking of people to the cities, off the land, into the city. And the city is the city is the future. I mean, we know that. And we go to the city, we consume less, we have fewer children, we use far fewer resources, we've far fewer energy, and we take the pressure off the land that becomes rewilded. And this is my local city here. Whenever I'm asked to do an urban project, I kind of leap at it. But we do a different manner of building in an urban context, because when we look at this, again, we can see the only buildings that are of the type that we are taught to design at architecture schools there's 2. There's the two churches, the building that we can see every elevation of in the round that sit with space around them. Every other building has a different purpose, and we're not taught to make those buildings at architecture school. They're the backdrop to public realm. They're the ordinary buildings of the city that just push themselves to the back of the street, and they make a street edge, they make a square, they make a space that contains a public piece of landscape. And that's the primary duty of a building in the city. And the buildings that I'm going to talk about are the buildings, the sort of blacky buildings with the kind of zinc roofs on just behind the tree on the left of the photo. So Bath is a city that has a very formal logic set out primarily in Georgian times, and built in one hit as a sort of modernist idea. And between that and the river is where the interesting stuff happens. Grain, goods, people would come up from the river, and artisans made stuff along the river. And there's a much more informal language of buildings on the river, as you can see, courtyards and spaces. But as all of that had disappeared, all of that was beginning to fall away, and a lot of these courtyards were falling into disrepair. And historically, the river had been used to navigate, and you could walk along the river, and all of that was closing off. So we worked out what we wanted to do was make a courtyard scheme that invited people from other courtyards to walk into this courtyard. And over time, we were hoping that all of these courtyards will become linked up again and people can walk through a series of artisan courtyards parallel to the river and parallel to the main thoroughfare. And we also worked extensively with the local authority to make a piece of legislation that every permission that comes, every scheme that comes forward along the river now has to open up the riverfront as a public promenade. So it means in 10, 15 years time, you'll be able to walk from the edge of the city into the city along the river. So our scheme was the first that, then you can walk along our scheme into the next scheme, into the next, and so on. And this is the language of those buildings. It's simple warehouses on the left with these are the buildings that sit around us with the sort of flying staircases. And when I look at this is the courtyard next to us, everything that you need to make a building is there. How do you bring north light in? How do you access at high level? What materials do you use? How do you make a big opening? They're there. And this is what we did. We just made a very simple scheme for a health clinic and a martial arts studio and some housing, just by pushing it all to the edges of the site, clearing view corridors through it, and making as big a courtyard as we could possibly make. And we then had to solve the challenge of how we would bring light into the clinic. So there's a slightly unusual section here. So this is the ground floor. You can see everything. There's tons of accommodation, too much program, which I like, pushed to the edges of the site. And then on the left, we have a series of treatment rooms with, on the back, on the left, you can see ostensibly they had no natural light. So we had to shunt the top floor over to run a continuous clerestory, which meant we can vent over the exposed slab of the first floor and allow people to have a treatment lying on their back, looking at the sky. So on the left of this, you can see that section. There's this roof light that runs along. You can lie on the back of underneath that and have a treatment and look at the sky. Martial arts above. Again, with a view of the sky, and this a kind of complex ventilation strategy that we had to prove that 30 people could be in there in midsummer shouting and doing taekwondo without anyone hearing anything, without it being air conditioned. That again is kind of super interesting. So a series of passive baffle vents that bring air in. And then the housing on the river, and the one move there is to push out a piece of the first floor accommodation to bring a light scoop in that allows south light to come in and allows you to have views up and down the river. So that's the scheme as we built on the left-hand side. And this is then the dark material that comes in, wraps in as a piece of public realm that shows you that's all public. You're invited to come in. And then the more special stuff that sits above and above and above, and that's the kind of, you can sit in the corner, and that's the martial arts space. That's the courtyard, and you can walk through this courtyard into the neighboring courtyard. You can see someone's doing exactly that there, and someone can go the other way into the other courtyard the other way. So we're sort of making a piece of public realm. That is the primary motivation, and that's what you need to do in a city, as you'll know. You need to, your primary obligation is that of neighborliness. Is you make something that's a backdrop to public realm and something that fits with your neighbors. I don't mean architecturally fits, but actually forms something that is greater than this sense of an isolated building in landscape. You have a responsibility to make space around you in a city, I feel. This is the language of the staff that's looking across the river at it. This is the martial arts studio with that light, and then the connection that you go through, processional, you get changed and come through this sort of, cloister into the scheme. And then, one of the questions that we have is, pre-industrial revolution. This is a place we've been working for, 3 or 4 years. It's a hotel, in fact. It's a house that was owned by my godfather's uncle that has been turned into a hotel. And, we look at this map and we see pre-industrial revolution. We see this is the geological map of the United Kingdom. And you take this material from the ground and you'd use it above ground. And, what does that mean? And post-industrial revolution, when we can do anything, what does it mean to take a material from the ground? And if you drive through the United Kingdom, it's an amazing thing to see. I have a very ambivalent relationship with this country, but one of the things I love is driving through this country. And if you move a few meters off a particular geological seam, the buildings are different or were different. And that's kind of fascinating. So what we looked at in this, when we were asked to make a building, and unfortunately I can't use my cursor, otherwise I would show you our site. If I zoom in a bit, our site, you can see a formal vegetable garden right in the center with this cross through it. And to the northeast of that is a retaining wall with a bit of land. And we were asked to make a building there that is a gym for the hotel. And we thought the context was super interesting. And we'll almost do no building. We'll just do one wall that's a kind of orangery that faces south. An orangery is a building, historical building here that we made as a glass house that sat at the back of a vegetable garden. We'll make one move, one wall, and all it will do is look into this vegetable garden and form the backdrop to this space. But given that there will be other stuff that is needed apart from a window, what will we do? So this is the context looking into that vegetable garden that was designed by a famous gardener called Penelope Hobhouse. And this is that wall. And we said, okay, this wall is an amazing stuff. This stone is an amazing thing that's come out of the ground in this landscape. Why don't we just use that? Why don't we just crush it, take it and crush it and reuse it and make a crushed stone building that can just sit there using this absolute material in the same place, push the building behind and use the stone then to frame the glass. So this is that sketch of the building, and this is then the building that we made. So we took that material and we crushed it and we used it just to make a window with and nothing else. There's no other move. It's the simplest and kind of dumbest building in some ways that I've ever made. It has one move, one inflection, and it takes the material and it uses it just to make a window that looks into this vegetable garden. So the idea is that you exercise in this space and you look out and you're sort of immersed and held in this kind of sensory landscape through that 15-meter window that, again, I mean, it isn't to kind of boast, it's a sort of fact that I think is the biggest window in the world outside of Apple, California. So these pieces of glass that are come on a truck from Austria, it's kind of crazy, in single pieces, 50 meters long, 3.5 meters wide. I mean, it was mad. Poppies, this must be early spring, looking in there, this crushed stone, and looking into that space, lined in tail works. Blue lias, that's the other material for the handrail, bringing you in. And in fact, we're just doing a yoga studio now behind this. And in fact, we're just in the process of finishing. It's taking forever because there's a fit out that's happening. We've just finished, and I'll just quickly show you this, a little apiary building where people can go and be immersed in the world on an old landfill site in the estate, and this is waiting for the fit out that will encapsulate those beams, and hives will come in and you'll be able to walk around with bee hives all around you, observational hives, and come and find out about bee habitats. But I'm just touching on that because it isn't finished. I'm just really now going to finish with a couple of work in progress projects to show the sort of other things that we're doing. And this is a project we've been working on for 4 years that is a very long, thin site that goes down to the water in the southwest of this country in a place called Cornwall. It's a long, thin site on terrible ground, and was a really old ramshackle bungalow there. And that house had just one view of the sea from one room, and all the other rooms behind it had no view of the sea. And our brief to ourselves was that we're going to replace this house. Every room should have a view of the sea, every single room. And also, but how do you do that on a long, thin site? And within that, we'll make a series of courtyards that the wind comes up from the Atlantic and buffets this part of the world. So we'll make a series of courtyards, which means that you can be out in all weathers, and you can move through the ground floor of the house through a series of outside courtyards. And the first floor, you can open all these courtyards and get light down into all these. And you can see really in this diagram that everything just looks past everything else. And of course, that's how we'd all do it. It's a kind of fairly obvious solution, but the house looks convoluted because everything just looks past everything else, and it isn't a house to be looked at, it's a house to be in, experiencing this landscape. And this is the kind of state of progress. It has a few more weeks to go, being built incredibly slowly because the site is very, very restricted. But you can see what I mean, that when you come in, even at the end of this corridor, 30 meters away, you get a view of the sea. And then there are these courtyards that drop down through the house that bring light and ventilation. And you can open up all those courtyards as well to have natural air all around you. And again, the kind of language of this is that everything looks past everything else. Part of the reason it's been so slow is that we've made everything. We made the staircase, we made a kitchen, we made everything. We've made every single component has been manufactured in a bespoke manner. Staircase, handrails, sinks, kitchen, fireplaces, all made in a slow and painstaking manner. The slates just cut by hand from the slate. This is from a Delabole quarry that exists 3 miles away. Copper for all the roofing, which is an old Cornish material. Again, this is the kind of state of play now, and spatially it isn't yet there. And I think this is semi-finally, I've nearly wrapped up, you needn't worry. I just wanted to finish with 2 projects. One is Moonshine again, the house that we made 20 years ago, that I have described as a place that I'd fallen out of love with as I got older, and I'd seen all the kind of, contortions of my youth played out every day and reminding myself every day as I looked at them, you know, how little I knew then and how little I know now. But I didn't want to be surrounded by the same reflections. And also, increasingly, as I've got older, I wanted a house that just performed really well. And my knowledge when I built this house was based on a different climate in Australia, and through living on a site for 20 years, I wanted to make this house a place that I would want to be for the times that I am in the United Kingdom. And as I said, I'm trying to extract myself from the United Kingdom, partly because the politics are so divisive. But either way, what we did really was just wrap the whole house. We've wrapped the whole house in what we call a duvet that goes 450 millimeters outside of everything that existed beforehand, up over the roof, down the other side, and under the floors, and wrapped everything in a super insulation, lots of membranes, with then just windows that can open to vent. Same diagram, same footprint, same everything, but just it's been really, I felt like this house was like one of my children that might have had rickets. It just had been abandoned. I hadn't looked after it, and I wanted to invest in something that would work again for the next 20 years. And everything that's yellow then was just over insulated, overclad, fewer. In fact, it's kind of counterintuitive, presumably to someone that lives in such a fantastic climate as India, to make the windows smaller, but there was too much glazing, too much heat loss, particularly on the north side. So we reduced a lot of that glazing. And this is then a diagram of how the insulation went under the floor and over the walls and over everything, and then wrapped and sealed and taped to make a building that was much, much, much more efficient in how it deals with climate. So as you approach now on the north side, the same move, you know, you can see straight through the building, but then the bedrooms above are overclad and all the timber structure is overclad. And it means that it's a super airtight building when we need it to be, but it can still open up and we can still spill out into the landscape when we want as well. So the same doors, same openings on the ground floor, newer doors and windows, obviously, but you can see the thickness of everything that's been added, 450 mil of insulation. And it's a joy having a building that hardly needs heating now. You have a little app that measures it, and the temperature drop off, I think last night was kind of 0.5 degree or something, so it's kind of working. So we take it kind of seriously, this responsibility of just trying to do buildings that use, you know, very little energy. This is the house. Similar house, and described it to me once as less sexy now, but probably more sensible. I don't know whether that's true or not. The floor is, again, overclad and the same. Then, you know, very little else has changed. Kitchen has to be raised because, you know, we'd raise the floor up with insulation and heating that runs off PVs on the roof, you know, and so on. Thicknesses you can see there of all the openings, deep reveals full of insulation, you know, etc. There's one of my kids, Lily. And same ability to open up and let the sun in and let the landscape in and let the air through and let the landscape come right the way through the house when we want it to. But, you know, all of these things, I wonder, my existential dilemma is how do we make a building that is as beautiful as the type of building that, the type of thing that people make instinctively without thinking about how they do something. It's a stack of bricks my neighbor made. And, you know, I photographed it and sent it to my friend Kate, and she said, God, it's so hard being an architect when that which is undesigned is so beautiful. And that's the kind of tension I carry, is how do we do a building that is big and yet has the element of the undesigned? So finally, another work in progress is a scheme I've been working on in the south of the United Kingdom for 7 years actually, sorry. And it's a scheme that has been designed with a kind of single purpose to solve these things. You know, we've been given, or my client has, a huge amount of public money, £7 or £8 million of public money to build this because they can solve these things. And, you know, it has these problems. They put together a piece of research that took them 5 years to do, which set out how a building could solve those things. This is the kind of context, harbour context, where all the industries disappeared, the rope making is gone, it's a divided town, and England is incredibly divided, always divided because of politics. But this town has come together and kind of coalesced around these projects. And just to give you a kind of snapshot of where it is now, we've designed a scheme that sits on this old harbour. And again, back to my connection of, or my idea of sort of cities are about connection. This is a little town. But the primary move was understanding how we can make a series of links that connected this site to the rest of the town. So the site is where the yellow highlight is. And we really have tried to invest in understanding where we can reopen pedestrian footpaths that run along the coast, how we can make effectively just a piece of public promenade that can be used. And if we make a piece of public promenade, how do we bring people in? and I'll quickly show you. So we made on the ground a kind of plinth, a single plinth that makes a courtyard with all public realm that just run past it. And on top of that plinth, we just make a piece of public realm. And then we place a series of informal buildings that are kind of undesigned, that kind of stack up and jostle for position, make a series of courtyard spaces that are for artists and makers to make in. And over time, they'll change and adapt, become more informal. And that piece of the coast has a history, bottom left, of raised public promenade. This is a Victorian pier. Top left, the kind of lookout structures. Top right, the kind of way we make solid plinths. And this is then the context. And that's what we did. We made, this is a aerial plan of the scheme that's on site at the moment, with a plinth with some big buildings that then have some smaller buildings around them that make a series of spaces that you can use to walk around and see what's being made in them. So this is a first floor piece of public realm, a raised piece of public realm that looks onto a courtyard that's a piece of public realm, that looks at an esplanade that's a piece of public realm that connects you back to the town, with where the 9 is a bridge that allows people to wander in and around this at any time, with at the top 5 little cottages then that you can stay in and look at. So bottom left, make a plinth, put some big 2, make some bigger buildings. 3, we make some smaller buildings that sit around those, and 4, we put some buildings on top that you can see, and rent and stay in. So kind of, my friend Meredith came to see this. He said, yeah, you've done the right thing. You made a plinth and you put some tat on top of it, And in a way, it was kind of tongue in cheek, but it has an informal, there's an informal relationship that these buildings have to what's there historically, and they make, again, a series of places and a series of connections back. And I like always having too much program, so everything has to kind of jostle for position and move up and push itself around to kind of find the light or find a view or find a piece of space. But what I suppose is so interesting about this project for me is that, the architecture is easy. Architecture is incredibly easy, really, in some ways, compared to understanding how a building can make change. And this is what my clients have done. So again, courtyard, raised public realm around it, and then studios and workshops that sort of sit informally around all of that. But what my clients have done is to be able to tell you that those buildings do these things, and they make 37 jobs, they bring in all of this change, this money, this tourism, they make this floor space. There's and they can tell you critically what the territory of the project is, how big a region this impact. That's incredibly complex and incredibly skilled. And for me, it's an incredible privilege to be part of a project that is so thoroughly embedded in where it is, that goes so far beyond the architecture to really be about the consequences of architecture. And this is, final few shots, and and kind of where it's at, and it'll be finished and open next year, and a major kind of cultural centre for this part of the United Kingdom.